The Supreme Court just quietly helped Trump again. In Washington, the loudest political battles usually dominate the headlines: elections, scandals, protests, wars. But sometimes, the decisions that quietly reshape a country happen far away from television cameras, hidden inside legal documents, courtrooms, and government systems most people never pay attention to. Just wait. The Supreme Court made one of those decisions. At the center of the case were immigration judges, federal officials responsible for deciding who can stay inside the United States and who must leave. For years, many of these judges argued that they should have the right to publicly discuss problems inside America's immigration system. Some wanted to speak about political pressure. Others wanted to discuss court backlogs, deportation policies, or the growing chaos surrounding immigration enforcement. But under restrictions connected to policies from the Trump era, public speech became heavily controlled. Immigration judges were limited in what they could say publicly without government approval. Interviews, public appearances, and political commentary suddenly became dangerous territory. Critics immediately argued that the policy violated the First Amendment, one of the most sacred principles in American law. They believe federal officials should still have the right to speak openly about problems inside the system they work in, especially when immigration had become one of the most politically explosive issues in the country. But supporters of the restrictions saw the situation very differently. To them, immigration judges were not independent political activists. They were government employees working inside one of the most sensitive systems in America. Allowing officials to publicly criticize immigration policy, they argued, could damage public trust, undermine federal authority, and create political chaos inside the court system itself. Then came the Supreme Court. The ruling did not completely end the legal battle. In fact, much of the case still remains unresolved. But the court's decision effectively protected the restrictions for now, allowing the government to maintain tighter control over public speech connected to immigration judges. To many Americans, the ruling barely registered. It was buried beneath larger headlines, political drama, and non-stop media noise. But legal analysts immediately understood why the decision mattered, because beneath the technical legal language was something much larger, another quiet expansion of presidential authority inside the federal system. For years, Donald Trump built much of his political identity around immigration. Border security became one of the defining issues of modern American politics. But behind the speeches, rallies, and campaign slogans was another objective that often received less public attention: strengthening executive control over the federal government itself. This case reflected that larger vision. The debate was no longer simply about immigration policy, it was about power, about who controls government messaging, about whether federal officials can publicly challenge policies created by the White House. And, perhaps most importantly, it raised a deeper question many Americans are only beginning to confront. How much control should the federal government have over the people working inside its own institutions? For critics, the answer feels increasingly dangerous. They fear America is slowly normalizing stronger centralized power inside the executive branch, especially during moments of political crisis. They worry that government employees may eventually become afraid to publicly criticize policy decisions altogether. But supporters see something completely different. They argue that modern America faces enormous challenges: illegal immigration, border instability, political division, and growing distrust in government institutions. In their view, stronger executive authority is necessary to maintain order inside a system already under massive pressure. And somewhere between those two perspectives lies the real reason this case matters. Because while the headlines focused on technical legal arguments, the Supreme Court may have quietly helped reshape the balance of power inside the American government once again, and almost nobody noticed. Why Trump wants more control over immigration? To understand why this Supreme Court case matters, you first have to understand one thing about modern American politics. Immigration is no longer just a policy issue. It has become a symbol of power, identity, fear, and national control. For Donald Trump, immigration was never simply about border security. From the very beginning of his political rise, it became the emotional center of his movement. The message was simple, direct, and powerful. America had lost control of its borders, and only strong leadership could restore order. That message changed American politics forever. Supporters saw Trump as a leader, willing to confront problems other politicians ignored. Critics saw something much darker, a strategy designed to turn immigration into a permanent political weapon. But beneath the political speeches and campaign rallies, another battle was quietly unfolding inside the federal government itself. A battle over control. Because immigration in America is not managed by one single office. It involves courts, judges, federal agencies, law enforcement, border officials, and massive bureaucratic systems spread across the country. And when those systems become politically divided, presidential administrations lose the ability to fully control how immigration policy is enforced. That is why the fight over immigration judges became so important. Inside the White House, immigration judges were not viewed as completely independent public commentators. They were federal officials operating inside one of the most politically sensitive systems in the nation. From the administration's perspective, allowing judges to publicly criticize immigration policy could weaken federal authority and create confusion around enforcement. Critics immediately pushed back. They argued that restricting speech inside government systems creates a dangerous precedent. If judges, experts, or federal employees become afraid to publicly discuss problems inside the system, transparency begins to disappear. And once transparency disappears, public trust often follows. But supporters of stronger executive authority argue something equally powerful. They believe modern governments cannot function effectively if every federal employee publicly undermines policy decisions. In their view, national security systems require discipline, coordination, and unified messaging, especially during periods of political instability. This is where the immigration debate becomes much larger than immigration itself, because the real question is no longer simply who should be allowed into America. The real question is how much authority should the president have over the federal system? And that question is becoming increasingly important as America grows more politically divided. For decades, the American system was designed around limits on centralized power. Courts, agencies, judges, and institutions were supposed to balance each other. But in recent years, many legal experts believe that balance has started to shift. Presidential authority has expanded during wars, expanded during national emergencies, expanded during border crises, expanded during moments of political fear, and every expansion creates a new precedent. Trump supporters often argue this is necessary. They believe weak governments create chaos, especially in areas like immigration, crime, and national security. To them, stronger executive power means faster action, stronger borders, and more stability. But critics see the situation differently. They fear America is slowly entering an era where presidents gain increasing control over institutions that were once designed to operate independently. And once those powers become normalized, future administrations, Republican or Democrat, may inherit authority far beyond what earlier presidents ever possessed. That is why this Supreme Court case matters so much. because beneath the legal language and technical court arguments lies a much bigger political transformation happening inside America itself. The battle over immigration is no longer only happening at the southern border, it is happening inside the courts, inside federal agencies, inside the Constitution, and inside the future structure of presidential power in the United States. Is America giving presidents too much power? Every major democracy eventually faces the same question: how much power should one leader truly have? For most of American history, the answer was intentionally complicated. The United States was designed around limits, checks, and institutional balance. Congress controlled legislation. Courts interpreted the law. Federal agencies operated with layers of independence. Presidents held enormous power, but never absolute control. At least, that was the theory. But over the last 2 decades, many Americans have started to notice something changing. Presidential authority keeps growing, sometimes gradually, sometimes quietly, and sometimes during moments of national fear when the public becomes willing to accept stronger government control in exchange for stability. The recent Supreme Court case tied to immigration judges may seem technical on the surface, but for many legal analysts, it reflects a much larger transformation happening inside the American political system. Because every time executive authority expands, even slightly, the balance between government institutions shifts with it. Supporters of stronger presidential power argue the modern world demands it. America faces enormous challenges: border instability, international conflict, terrorism, political extremism, economic uncertainty, and growing distrust in public institutions. In their view, weak leadership creates paralysis. Presidents need the ability to act quickly, control federal systems efficiently, and respond to crises without endless institutional resistance slowing everything down. To millions of Americans, especially Trump supporters, stronger executive authority feels practical, even necessary. But critics see something far more dangerous emerging beneath the surface. They warn that democracies rarely lose freedom all at once. Instead, power slowly concentrates over time. Small legal decisions accumulate. Emergency powers become normalized. Institutions that were once independent gradually become more politically controlled. And eventually, people stop noticing the changes altogether. That fear is exactly why this immigration case triggered so much concern among constitutional experts. Because the debate is no longer only about immigration judges speaking publicly, it is about whether federal institutions are becoming increasingly dependent on presidential control. Can government employees openly criticize policy? Should judges inside federal systems remain independent voices? Or should the executive branch maintain tighter authority over how the federal government presents itself publicly? These questions are becoming central to America's political future. And the Supreme Court now sits directly in the middle of that transformation. Over the last several years, the court has repeatedly issued rulings that many analysts believe strengthen executive authority. Some legal scholars argue the court is slowly reshaping the relationship between presidents and the federal system itself. Supporters celebrate this shift. They believe America needs stronger leadership to survive an increasingly unstable world. Critics fear something else entirely: that the country may slowly be normalizing a presidency more powerful than the system originally intended. And perhaps the most unsettling part is how quietly all of this is happening. No dramatic speeches, no tanks in the street, no collapse of government, just legal rulings, court decisions, policy changes, and small shifts in institutional power that most Americans barely notice. But history often changes this way, not through one massive event, but through hundreds of smaller decisions that slowly reshape the system over time. That is why this Supreme Court case matters far beyond immigration. Because years from now, Americans may look back on moments like this and realize the structure of power inside the United States was already evolving long before most people understood what was happening.